a lot of events during the year. We have one big conference, and we also have smaller symposia where smaller groups, a little bit like sessions in a conference. And we also have then WINIR workshops, where it's even smaller events that are all sponsored by WINIR. This year, of course, things are very different. And so WINIR is now trying to shift some of its activities across to a more digital platform. And this is our very first attempt, hopefully a successful one, where we're going to have these larger kind of debates, keynotes, talking about bigger issues. And then having smaller workshops around specific themes, and also quite small informal type of events where researchers can meet and discuss just paper ideas or something that they've started working on, but wanting to get out to a somewhat different audience to what they normally are seeing in their own departments. Finally, I would also just like to say that WINIR is a sponsor of the Journal of Institutional Economics, which of course then feeds into the WINIR events and the WINIR community, when it's open for everybody to submit papers. But without much further ado, I'm going to leave the room for Martin Andersson from Lund University, who will be chairing this session. So thank you very much, and nice to see so many of you here. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. And good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon to everyone that are happen to be in Europe or Africa. Good morning if you are in the Americas. Good evening if you are in Asia, or good night even, perhaps. It is a true pleasure for me to be able to chair this session with two such distinguished researchers, such as Professor Deirdre McCloskey from University of Illinois, Chicago, and Professor Geoffrey Hodgson from Loughborough University, London. None of these characters need any further presentation, but I will spend a minute on it anyway. It's fair to say, I think, that both of them have devoted much of their academic career to explaining and understanding the origins and mechanisms of economic growth and long-term growth, which is the theme of this session, of course, the great enrichment, and the origin and spread of modern economic growth, if you will. Arguably still the most important question in the social sciences. And I also think it's fair to say that both of them are amongst the two most hardest working persons in the business. They have both of them produced more books than Sidney Sheldon and John Le Carré together, I think. According to Professor McCloskey's homepage, I think over the last 5 months, she has scored 1 book a month, which must be regarded as quite impressive. But besides being very prolific authors, they are known, I think, of being critics and of economics as we know it, and also neo-institutional economics, but they might be differing in their view on the role of institutions for long-term growth. We will see what this debate what they will have to say about this throughout this debate. Maybe it will be the academic equivalent of Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. I don't know, let's see, but I'm sure that it will be an educating and entertaining 1.5 hours before us. So before I hand over the word to Deirdre, I will just say something on the roadmap of these 90 minutes. So I will give 10 minutes each to Deirdre and Geoffrey, after which they will debate amongst each other for 20 to 30 minutes or so. After that, there will be an opportunity for all of us, all of you, for 40 to 50 minutes of Q&A. And you can raise your questions in the with the Q&A function in the system. And you can do that throughout the presentations, and then I will try, and also with the help of Tobias, to edit them and hand over the word to you. And then you will have to unmute yourself, pose your question to Geoffrey or Deirdre. I think that's it. So let's get started and and also one more thing. If you like to see the speaker popping up on the big frame, you just have to go to the 3 dots at the southeast corner of your screen, and there you change the setting or the layout to and push layout, and then you push spotlight, and then you will see Deirdre and Geoffrey when they speak on the big screen. So let's hand over the word and the scene to Professor McCloskey. Go ahead if you're there.
Hi, how are you, dears? I'm old enough to remember the great...
You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute myself. Well, I can't get myself, so I find it hard to unmute.
Deirdre, can you please unmute yourself on the...
So Deirdre was unmuted, but then she dropped out.
Yes, we hear her, but she left.
Can you
now.
hear her? I can't.
We were hearing her, yes.
Okay. She was muted, and she, I think, perhaps accidentally pushed the wrong button and left the meeting instead of unmute herself.
Maybe
so let's give her a minute to return. These are the nice things that can happen when we are infants in terms of use of technology.
Was it there? Oh, there. Am I unmuted? Oh, praise the Lord.
Perfect.
These things are always designed by engineers, of course, because they're very nice. Some of my best friends are engineers, but they don't think of consumers very often. I'm old enough, speaking of heavyweight fights, to remember a Swedish heavyweight, Johansson, a long time ago. I don't regard this as a battle or even a debate. Jeff and I agree on a great deal. We're against, I think it's fair to say, certain, shall we call them, mechanical versions of institutionalism. That is, those that depend very heavily on, say, non-cooperative game theory, or those that seem to assume, they often don't make it explicit, that if there's a law, it gets followed. I think we in the United States, after the age of Trump, no longer make that assumption. My basic point, and I think it's Jeff's too, although I don't think he embraces it as enthusiastically as I do, is that ethics, persuasions, speech are crucial to the operation of an economy or a polity or a society. And I further argue in my trilogy on all this that speech, rhetoric, ideas, individual ideas that then are persuasive or not to other people in the society, to bankers and customers and other entrepreneurs, are the spring in the economic watch. I've become more and more Austrian as I get older, and I've then in my trajectory from conventional, well, in the old days I was a sort of unscholarly Marxist, and then I became a so-called neoclassical, I'd rather call it Samuelsonian economist, and then Chicago School, and then Austrian, and then beyond Austrian, I think, to what I and a few other people call humanomics. That is economics with the humans left in. And I would claim in an Austrian way that human action is central to economic growth, and not just central, as I say, it's the spring. I would argue about neo-institutionalism as often argued, often presented, that it's the gears in the watch. And yeah, they're necessary, and it's quite helpful to have a main gear that moves around. But the motive force in the watch is speech, language, persuasion, ethics learned at your mom's knee. I think we, and this is a somewhat feminist point, we in economics and in a lot of the social sciences these days ignore the fact that we were all children once and had upbringings. Donald Trump is again a splendid and horrible example. In any case, I don't think it's entrepreneurship, because I believe that all societies have a certain percentage, 10%, 5%, 15% of people who are prepared to take a chance to, as we find in academic life and in all sports and all kinds of human activities. What matters, and I argue this in some detail, especially in the third volume of this crazy trilogy of mine, what matters is the attitude of the surrounding society. If the surrounding society hates innovation, the very word innovation was, so to speak, a swear word until well into the 19th century, then innovation won't take place, and these entrepreneurs, instead of being rewarded, will be punished. So my answer to the overall question of this this conversation with you, Jeff, is that yes, of course, institutions matter to the great enrichment, just as capital accumulation matters, or rainfall matters, or the existence of the universe matters. There are an infinite number of necessary conditions for any event, whether social or physical. And so, yes, one can argue various counterfactuals. A famous one in economic history is the great Robert Fogel, imagining what the world would have been like in 1890 without the railway. And what Fogel found is that, yeah, it was, railways are important, but they're not the whole story, and their effect, at least in the United States, was not enormous. Now that, it seems to me, is the central, what can we say, critical scientific problem in explaining the Great Enrichment with the usual explanations. Capital accumulation, exploitation of the third world, slavery, human capital accumulation, entrepreneurship, the sort of thing that Max Weber talked about, a psychological change in entrepreneurs, which I don't think is true, and all the others. The problem is its size. Since 1800, and there isn't any controversy about this, income per head has increased in places like Finland or Japan by a factor of 30, conservatively measured, and more like a factor of 100, if you allow for the increased quality of goods and services. Okay, that's 3,000%. Now, suppose the percentage of entrepreneurs in the society goes up from 5% to 10%, increasing by 100%. Does it really seem plausible to you that that change would cause a 3,000% increase compared with the long history of poverty? Now, so the argument I'm making, and here I'll try to end because I haven't been keeping track of the time, which is fatal for a college professor. The problem is that institutions, most of the institutions that people talk about, rule of law, et cetera, are intermediate, economically speaking. They're intermediate inputs in the same way that capital is. But capital accumulation and rule of law are ancient institutions. Furthermore, one thing that makes new institutionalism attractive to lots of economists and other people is that it can be sort of defined to be true. Now, I don't think Jeff does this. He and I have had a back and forth about this. In the same way that Max U, Smithsonian economics, can explain everything, because you can just add love into the utility function, and that takes care of love. Or if you can just view the utility maximization as people doing what they do, which you can see is not much of an explanation. And the same thing is a danger, I think, in the institutionalism. Now, I don't think my position that ethics is crucial. I keep saying crucial, that's not quite what I mean, is causal. It was a change in ethical thinking first in Holland and then in Britain in the first Holland in the 17th and Britain in the 18th century that, in my opinion, caused the modern world. Which is to say, it was a change in the opinion people had about the middle class and about merchants and about invention, which you can see in the in the person of Ben Franklin. Now, I don't want to just throw ethics into the category culture. People often understand that that's what I'm saying, and it's not. I'm not a rebirth of David Landis. What economists do is throw things into culture and then say, well, culture is just background. It doesn't ever change. But it does change. It changes very fast. Germany, that for 12 years was dominated by Hitler, became a model democracy very fast. So that's my basic view. Yeah, institutions are there. By the way, institutions understand. However you define the word, are often extremely conservative and would have stopped human progress of any sort. So I'm not a neo-institutionalist. In one way or another, as I think back on it, I and lots of other economic historians have been studying the institutionalist hypothesis all our lives, pardon me, without being aware. We've been speaking prose without being aware of it. I mean, we're always off in the background are social causes, you might call them, S I call them, for speech. And as an economist, I've evolved from saying, no, entrepreneurship's not important at all, go away, society. I just want to hear about Max Hu. That's how I was when I was young. And now I'm the opposite. So I suppose you could say +1 - 1 equals 0.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Interesting indeed. Thank you very much for that. You look terrified, but I will soon or directly now hand over the word to Geoffrey. So go ahead, Geoffrey.
Hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me. There's a big echo here. Okay, that's better. It's a great pleasure to talk to Deirdre. Deirdre and I have known each other for 32 years, I think, when we first met, and we've been in contact for much of that time since, and it's always a great pleasure to talk and argue with Deirdre about things that we care about. And as Deirdre says, we agree on a lot. We share a criticism in particular of Max Hu approaches in economics, which makes us very unpopular with other economists. So Deirdre and I have to stick together on that because we're in a minority. I much enjoyed in particular reading Deirdre's trilogy of books. The latest volume is here, Bourgeois Equality, How Ideas, Not Capital or Institutions Enrich the World. I'm now looking forward to the 4th volume because Deirdre seems to admit now that institutions matter. Okay, what she said a few minutes ago, of course, institutions matter. Well, that really contradicts the subtitle of the volume that I just showed you. Institutions matter or they do not. I think what she's trying to get at is something else, which I'll come to in a minute. But I must emphasize I completely agree with Deirdre about the importance of ideas. Ideas are central. Ideas without ideas, you get no change, you get no innovation, you get no institutions, you get no economic activity, you get no economic growth. So the accent on ideas is essential. But we must also ask the question, having traced key developments in the history of ideas, and Deirdre does this brilliantly in her books, showing how certain ideas emerged and took root, we have to go through the mechanics of that process. Why and how and in which context did those ideas arise? What helped them to take root? What helped them to spread? And what helped them to have impact in a wider population? It's not enough to identify the ideas. We have to look at the context of those ideas as well. So it's there for me that institutions come in. Institutions are the part of the story which tell us how ideas take root, which tell us how those ideas spread and how ideas become a force for change. I agree with Deirdre that institutions are often essentially conservative, but there's a literature on institutional change, and it's through clashes and crises within institutions that we get change, and their ideas come forth and spread and help to change things. Looking at Deirdre's books in her trilogy, her argument is very much focused on the new institutional economics, in particular on Doug North, who we both knew well. Now, we both agree that Doug had a lot of insight, but we both disagree that there's about some aspects of his work. And I quote a very important point where I share with Deirdre in one of our books. This is in Bourgeois Dignity, the second volume. Against North, she says, institutions do not merely constrain human behavior, giving prices to what people have incentive to respond. They express humanness, giving it meaning. And that's a brilliant Deirdre piece of writing, capturing a vital point that institutions are part of the structures that through which we interact and through which, in part, we gain meaning in our lives, and which have major effects both economically and historically. There are other institutional theorists we could look at. I mean, I'm going to be a bit naughty now. I'm going to mention John Searle. John Searle, I think Deirdre admires Searle's work as well as I do. Now, he, for example, defines language as an institution. His view of an institution is a system of rules, in brief. So language also is a system of rules. Consequently, language is an institution, and for Deirdre, language is central, so institutions must be important. Now, of course, that's a rather sort of a covert, semi-trivial point against Deirdre's argument, but it's more than simply this definitional issue which I raised with Searle's definition. I think language itself, which is the medium through which ideas get expressed, also exhibits the properties of social relatedness. It's not simply in individuals' heads. It's about interaction, it's about structure, it's about social relations. We don't think simply with the brain, we don't simply think internally, we think through others, through interaction, and with material things as well. Now, these capacities are not reducible to individuals alone, so we have to consider the structures in which individuals act and interact. So ideas matter, but so do institutions, and each helps to constitute the other. Now, I think from what Deirdre's just argued, I think she's trying to get at something about which is, what's the prime mover here? Okay, well, in a sense, human agency is a prime mover, but I think it while not undermining that point at all. I completely agree with it. It's also true to say that each individual is a consequence of previous events, previous individuals, previous circumstances. Deirdre says institutions are intermediate, but every idea is intermediate. Every idea came from, developed out of previous ideas and gives birth to further different ideas. Every individual is intermediate. Every individual has parents and ancestry, and it affects others either through children or through social effects. Our imprint goes on future generations. So everything in the great chain of being is intermediate. To say that institutions are intermediate, I don't think gives a decisive argument for relegation of institutions. They're important alongside individuals. Now, to conclude my argument, I'm going to be very brief. The other bit of the argument is not capital or institutions. Now, here again, Deirdre dismisses something, I think, something important in the explanation of the Great Enrichment. Personally, I'm with Schumpeter on this. I think that financial institutions are crucial in explaining the Great Enrichment. They're not the only thing that matter, but they're very important. Deirdre answers this point. She addresses Schumpeter in her book, In Bourgeois Dignity. Finance and saving, she writes, cannot be crucial for modern development. For places such as Athens, Florence, or Beijing would have innovated us into the modern world. Yes, she's absolutely right. Banking goes back to Mesopotamia. It's more than 3,000 years old, even longer perhaps. But modern banking doesn't. Modern banking is much more recent. Larry Neal, in his recent history of international finance, denotes the beginnings of modern banking, not the full establishment, the beginnings in the 15th century in the Genoese Republic. But in Italy, we had chaos and wars, which prevented the Italian capitalist system taking off. The baton was passed to the Dutch and then to the British for that process of enrichment. We know the story, we know the details. So modern finance is relatively recent, and I think Schumpeter is correct to say that financial institutions were crucial in that development. Deirdre, I'm afraid, confuses capital, finance capital, which Schumpeter emphasizes, with physical capital or capital goods. She writes in Bourgeois Equality, she sees capitalism as the accumulation of capital goods, to quote her, piling brick on brick. Now that's capital goods or physical capital, but it's not finance capital. Finance capital is about institutions of property, finance, credits, credit markets, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, Schumpeter himself puts it, he says capitalism is that form of private property economy, which is institutions, in which innovations are carried out by means of borrowed money, which in general implies credit creation. So Schumpeter, in a nutshell, is emphasizing financial institutions. So I look forward to the fourth volume, where Deirdre, of course, continues and quite rightly emphasizes the role of ideas, but also says how ideas and capital and institutions mattered for economic growth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. So I think Deirdre herself can answer the content of her forthcoming fourth book. So go ahead, Deirdre, please.
Well, this forthcoming book is a counterfactual. I had planned originally 6 books on this, and then 4, and then finally I realized that a long trilogy might be considered somewhat self-indulgent, but 4 books is an abomination. So that's why the 3rd volume is so thick, as I threw everything in. But I have got a book that came out last fall called Why Liberalism Works. And I've got a book on with Alberto Mingardi on innovation planning, and I've got this came out in this October, and I've got with Art Carden a book that is kind of a popular summary of the trilogy. And the point of mentioning all this is that the master idea, which I forgot to mention in my presentation, is liberalism. That's the spring. Of course, ideas for containerization or the Autobahn or the steam engine, so forth, or the modern university in which so many of us work, invented in 1810 at the University of Berlin. These are the ideas that have made us rich, no doubt about it. But what made them happen is the idea that all men and women here are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That egalitarian idea, I argue, made possible and inspired the extraordinary explosion of innovations since around 1800. And it was largely unplanned. There's a view that lots of people have, I think, that, oh, well, it must have been what we called in the United States internal improvements, government actions of various sorts that caused this. And that isn't very plausible. It's the liberation, gradual, admittedly, still not complete, of women, of poor men, of slaves, of immigrants, of gay people, and on and on and on, colonial people, that made us, as the English say, prepared to have a go. Now, when I say that institutions matter, I'm not conceding the point entirely. Although, you know, I'm open to the idea. I'm open to the idea, especially if some person in neo-institutionalism will quantify. This is one of the chief peculiarities of neo-institutionalism, very confidently asserted by people like Ashimoto and Robinson, who do excellent work, but, you know, and then adopted by the World Bank. They followed Doug North, the gospel of Doug North, add institutions and stir. Replaced in the World Bank their old formula of add capital and stir, whether financial or physical capital. So I'd like to see the numbers here. And as I said originally, the biggest problem is that the numbers with the explicandum is so enormous. You know, if it was a doubling of income since 1800 in countries, in many countries, you'd say, well, that's caused by a new improvement in the rule of law, the glorious revolution and all that. But it's not 100%, it's 3,000%. So it was not planned. It was, as Hayek says a spontaneous order, just as language is. So saying that language is an institution in this loose sense, by the way, in this dangerously circular sense, all human activity then becomes institutions, is, I think, a mistake. I think we have to go back to Doug North and talk about the rules of the game. And I think that's a narrow and falsifiable form of institutionalism, and it's been falsified. Just one more point on Neil and so on finance, the Schumpeterian hypothesis, which, by the way, was very premature. It's outlined in his great kind of long book, at least, on business cycles in the late 1930s. It was before we had done the research. So it's kind of, to go back to Schumpeter this way is like going back to Marx. You know, Marx was the greatest social scientist of the 19th century, without compare, in my opinion. That makes my conservative friends very angry. But he was. But he didn't have, scientific history hadn't developed, we didn't have the facts. Now notice, to say that modern finance is modern, which is what Jeff said, is rather typical of propositions in neo-institutionalism. There's a tendency to tautology, which Jeff is certainly aware of and tries to avoid. But beware. Beware of neo-institutionalists bearing gifts. Timeo
Thank you very much.
et dona pectus.
Hi. You'd like me to reply?
Boy,
Okay.
Yes. Are you a neo-institutionalist in disguise?
Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah. Well, thanks, Deirdre, for the response. I have a lot of misgivings, some of which I share with you, with some work which has been carried out. I admire the energy of Acemoglu and his colleagues, and I buy some of their arguments. And there's no doubt that they've made a major contribution. But I don't think it's a good strategy to try and move the discussion on by denying the role of institutions, right? By saying institutions don't matter, it's just ideas. I think you move things on by picking apart the issues and trying to understand the key relations, causal forces, and so on in the argument. And that's more my strategy, to try and understand it. For example, with Acemoglu and also with North, I think they get the institutional story wrong about the Glorious Revolution.
yeah, they do.
1688. And then they both repeat a statement that says North and Barry Weingast in the famous 1989 paper, and Acemoglu in a series of publications with his colleagues, both said that property rights were insecure before 1688. Now that's maybe in other countries, but not the case in Britain. Britain had a well-established legal system from about the 12th century onwards, when there was major reforms of the law, particularly under Henry II and others. Now, of course, the law was only for the rich. I mean, that's the way things are. It's a sad way of the world. But if you were a landowner and you didn't commit treason, and if you didn't choose the wrong side of a civil war, your property was relatively secure. And you had recourse to a legal system which was hugely imperfect and corrupt, but nevertheless, in a sort of shoddy way, it protected property. most of the time for most people. And to say the property rights were completely insecure because of an example of a king confiscating some money, only one or two examples. I mean, the biggest examples they don't mention is the dissolution of the monasteries. But anyway, it's a misreading of the facts.
Yes.
And the facts there are institutional facts. The British or the English legal system was well developed several hundred years before 1688. And Deirdre said that herself, and others have said it, like Fukuyama in their histories. Turning to modern finance, I didn't explain what I meant by modern finance. It's not modern simply because it's modern. Previous banks, banking systems and debt existed in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, all these places, China, all these places, without doubt. There were all those things going on. What there wasn't is a developed system of public debt, which was saleable, with developed markets for debt. There were some markets for debt, but they were not developed. This is the thing that Larry Neal and several others highlight in the history of finance. It's a growth of systems of public debt fusing with a private sector, a dynamic private banking system, which characterize the key aspect of modern finance. That's highlighted by Geoffrey Ingham in his book on capitalism, and also in some of his historical works. So what made it modern was the role of the public sector alongside the private sector in the banking system, which eventually, of course, led to the formation of central banks. We can argue about their efficacy, as people rightly do. The first one was in Sweden in 1668, and then it was followed by the Bank of England in 1694. And they developed through time as well. So that's the characterization of modern banking, which was absent in ancient Greece, it was absent in Rome, and it was only partially developed in Italy, and that development was interrupted. So it's not simply a definitional issue, it's actually highlighting the key characteristics of financial institutions.
Well, I would observe that it's somewhat odd to claim that expenditures by the crown, the English crown, during and after the 1690s, because of the invention of the government debt, that crowding out of private investment, which is very plain, for example, in the history of parliamentary enclosures in the late 18th century, is somehow an advantage. I've heard this argument. I've argued against it in a few pages that perhaps you missed. It's okay. We develop a market in government debt, as though Florence didn't have a government debt in the 14th century, as it did. Yeah, post hoc ergo propter hoc, but that's about the only economic logic I can see in this. But I don't think we should, either of us, should get off on these details. The key point is that liberalism and the inventive ideas that it spawned by freeing people from ancient hierarchies is the spring. And the other things are nice to have. Rule of law is certainly necessary. If there's a war of all against all going on, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But those, as you point out, Jeff, quite correctly, those features like rule of law and banking and so on and so forth, those exist all over the place. So we have a problem here. We have a scientific problem which has been missolved by turning again and again to what seem to people to be necessary conditions. or helpful conditions. Some people say that it was the canals that caused the Industrial Revolution. Well, they apparently don't know that there were canals hundreds of years before in China, much longer than anything in Europe until the late 19th century. So, you know, one more necessary condition. What we're looking for are the causal things, as you said before, the prime cause, the primum mobile, as the followers of Aristotle call it. And I say that's liberalism, which is unique to 18th century Northwestern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that there's no prime cause.
Yeah.
Right. There's no prime cause because everything is a long chain of causality.
Well, you know, that's one epistemological view.
Well, I mean, it's to get ideas, we need humans and with language, right?
Yeah.
And they came from, there were humans that didn't have language, and then there were our primate ancestors. So we go way back. Everything is a long causal chain. So it's important to highlight the big causal factors, and I agree with you that institutions are among them. Or bigger pardon, ideas are among them. But I also want to add institutions to that mix.
But wait, a lot of the institutions, as you've already agreed, were very conservative.
Yep.
Universities, except in Scotland and Holland, in the 18th century.
I'll give you an example which tackles the issue of crowding out, and it also tackles the issue of the role of central banking. Mm-hmm. I think that the debate about crowding out is not yet concluded. And it may be that in some instances, public financing did crowd out in innovation over some time periods. But maybe there's other effects too. The example I give is Boulton and Watt, the steam engine. Okay. Now, the steam engine was developed by Watt, based on previous models by other engineers, and the Boulton and Watt partnership was formed in 1775. Yeah. Now, they required a technology, and they required a certain advances in technology which have been accomplished by others to get their steam engine to work. Sure. And they adopted a mechanism which was used to bore cannon.
Indeed.
To rotate the casting, and that was patented by someone else prior to that to get a better steam engine. Now, where did that cannon boring come from? It came from the fact that for much of the 18th century, the British state was financing war. Yeah. Okay? Now, war has positive and negative effects. A lot of negative effects being people getting killed and so on, and all sorts of horrible things happening. But it can also act to some degree as an economic and technological stimulus, and that's what happened. And so part of the story, part of the balance sheet concerning public finance and the role of the state is some stimulation of some kinds of technology, which
but here
with the steam engine.
Here you sound like Mariana Mazzucato, who's created a stir about her views on industrial policy and innovation policy. And her view is that any change is good. She defends the Anglo-French Concorde, for example, which I think you and I would agree was a commercial disaster, more or less, from its earliest days. As well, it stimulates stuff and people do things. But you know, people do things without war too. They do things crazy government projects like glorious projects like the Anglo-French Concord. So I've written some. I think most of us have entertained this hypothesis that war is good for the economy at one time or another. And I just don't think it's true. I think you can show over and over and over again that economic growth. Look, Germany in 1600 had tremendous reserves of human capital, long history of commerce, and then it had the 30 Years' War. And it still was innovative in music, but not in industry.
Thank you very much. I think we can open up for some questions also from the audience. Is that all right?
Sure.
If so, I think we have a little list here. I think Lee Alston, if you're with us, you can have the first go.
Hi,
Yeah.
Lee.
Hey,
How are you?
Deirdre. I'm well, and yourself?
Good. I'm down here in Indiana. I'm helping take care of my 98-year-old mom who's failing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that.
She's had a
But
long.
we're close neighbors, and my mother's not far behind. She's turning 97. So,
Yeah.
but to the point, I think both you and Jeff don't give enough credence to Doug's later work. It wasn't very developed in his 1999 book, but he put a big emphasis on the role of mental models.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you've discussed this before, but I think the way I see it is that, again, it's the ideas, but what ideas? It's also ideas and beliefs about how institutions will affect outcomes.
Yeah,
And
I understand.
this is
Lee.
important.
Yeah, sure.
And so that the elites who are establishing, and I agree with you that the driving force and culture's too big and so on and so forth. I agree with you that liberalism was the liberating force that led to two things. One, and I don't think you always differentiate between these enough. One is new institutions, which are rules made by recognized authorities. And here I'm stealing, borrowing, having discussions with John Wallace about this. The other is liberalism, spontaneously ordered social norms.
Yes.
And people keep confusing those two. And the social norms, I think, are what you're talking about more, Deirdre. And I think they're very important because they're also very difficult to change. But they're repeated patterns of behavior. Yes, they do change at, I'm just saying compared to institutions, that is, let's say legal rules, those you can change. You may not be able to enforce them. So I agree with you that enforcement is the key. And the other thing you said that I think needs to be emphasized is the importance of institutions, beliefs, social norms as contextual.
Yeah, but look, I half agree. What you and I need to do, Lee, is to be colleagues for a term and talk this over thoroughly. The danger, if you start calling mores institutions, and then you, as Jeff quite correctly says by this definition, language or is an institution, is that then you're in this, there's the danger of tautology.
Oh, no, that's my point, Deirdre.
Yeah.
Au contraire, they're very different. I don't consider social.
And I agree that they interact. I agree that the institution of the Soviet Constitution, let's take an example, three versions, the Soviet Constitution. Well, needless to say, it didn't have any influence over the
Right.
mores of powerful people. Whereas we've just seen in the last month that the American Constitution held and was a force. And although, you know, I think Trumpism shows that these ideas can change very fast. These mores can change. I think it's a standard economic ploy to throw everything into culture and then ignore it as a background. That's what I used to do. I think so did you. And
Yeah,
you.
I don't think we're disagreeing.
No.
Deirdre. I'm just saying they shouldn't be conflated. We disagree about how quickly social norms can change. They
Well,
can be static for a long time and then flip suddenly. I agree with that. But this is the Austrian point, I think, is that they can't really be designed. The other point that I have to take some quibble with is, can we measure institutions?
Yeah.
Yes. You know, I'll give you an example. You know, we did this big project in the Amazon measuring the impact of land titles on land values and productivity and so on. And it mattered.
Yeah, but
so you
Yeah,
measure
yeah.
something. I mean,
That's
you're
not-
arguing. Sorry?
But Lee, that's not neo-institutionalism. That's what you and I have been doing all our lives. It's the
Well,
new
that's
economic history. And there, people do quantification. But I'm pointing out that, and I have a book that's coming out from the University of Chicago Press in about a year, where I go into this in some detail. There's an awful lot of sort of unattached assertion without measurement. And as I keep saying, the size of the Great Enrichment is the biggest scientific problem in explaining it. And let's see, there was one other point I was going to make, but I forget what it is. Let's go on. Who's
No,
next?
I think we basically are on the same page, and I agree.
I'm sure we've been on the same page, Lee, for about half a century, so I'm not surprised.
It is about half a century.
It is.
Thank you very much. We have another one here, unless Geoffrey wants to add to this. Otherwise, Michael Geoffrey, would you please raise your question? I think you raised your hand and you had a question also in the chat.
Yes, I did, because the topic that we're talking about is the Great Enrichment, and although we've understandably been concentrating on the Industrial Revolution in England, which was the first example, there have been other great enrichments, and I'll just choose one which is almost as historically huge, which is China in recent decades. Now that's catch-up growth as opposed to the innovation-based growth that cutting-edge economies have had. Now it seems to me that anything that explains growth of that magnitude must apply equally to catch-up growth. Mutatis mutandis, but the Great Enrichment is there as well. Now, I have been putting forward a hypothesis for some time now that actually what changed was the nature of the firm. You can trace this in 18th century England, and you can see it very clearly in the Chinese example from 1978 onwards, and you can also see it in other examples of successful capitalist economies, if you want to call them that, but economies which have undergone this dramatic or sometimes less dramatic increase in prosperity. And I don't understand why the focus is not on the nature of the firm, because these changes are very very clear cut. I've written on exactly what the changes were, and this hasn't been picked up at all. I've discussed this with both Deirdre and Geoffrey in the past, many years ago. To me, it's blindingly obvious.
Yeah,
there is an ideas component to it, and it's an institutional change. It's change in the firm, but not of the kind that's in the literature.
Well, please do send me some of that again, and I'll read it.
Thank you, Deirdre.
I think the changes in the nature of the firm are part of the story, but they're not the whole story. I'm sure you agree, Michael. There's other things that happen too. For example, in China, you mentioned 1978. As we agree, that's a crucial year. It's 2 years after Mao Zedong died, and it was the beginning of the reform process, right at the end of that year. And the starting point with that reform process, of course, it involved ideas, but it was a set of peasants getting together and deciding to disband the collective farm system, opt out of the collective farm system, and to have a family-based, what became to be called household responsibility system, which created a new set of de facto property rights and a new set of incentives for the peasants. And agricultural output exploded. It went up and up and up so fast that even the conservatives in the Chinese government had to acknowledge the importance of the change, and had to make it legal, de facto, de jure legal, in the early 80s, in 1980s. Now that was crucial. That was a precondition of the town-village enterprises. It was a precondition of the corporate and other changes which happened in China with the firm. So it's not just the firm, it's other things too. And also I think that in the British case, the change in the character of the firm was somewhat delayed by the bubble, the collapse of the bubble of 1720, which put undue restrictions on corporate law, and it was really the change in the corporation. The big changes came in the 19th century rather than the 17th century. I've got one more point I'll say very quickly. I mean, Deirdre has emphasized, I think quite rightly, the role of liberalism here. And I agree with her. Liberal ideas about equality, individual dignity, and so on are very, very important. But I don't think it's the whole story. I think it's more a complete enlightenment package of ideas, which include politics, they include philosophical ideas, which come under the label liberalism, if you like. But it also includes science. So I'm with Joel McCloskey on this point, that the development of science is also crucial. And that too required institutions. Science, sure. The development of science depended on institutions. I'll go into more detail if you want me to, but it wasn't simply individuals in attics thinking up ideas. It was actually interacting with other people in a scientific community, even before there were universities of any caliber or importance. And that's true in the British case, when in England there were only 2 universities, Oxford and Cambridge. Very backward educational system, and they were doing law and theology and not much else. But the scientists and engineers that got together organized themselves, and their institutions were crucial in that development. So it's liberalism plus science, the whole package of enlightenment ideas.
I don't think so. And here, Joe and I don't agree, although, again, like Jeff, I agree with the overlap between Joe McCloskey and me is enormous. The problem with the science argument, and I haven't ever gotten Joel to answer this in a serious way, is, again, quantitative. The Great Enrichment is not just elegant variation for the Industrial Revolution. The original Industrial Revolution, as nice as it was only about a century. But what's amazing is that it continued. But up to 1900, and for some purposes, not until after the Second World War, science was not a big cause of enrichment. Now, you know, this is quantifiable. You can find out. And I can't get Joe to take that project seriously.
Can I just come back on the question of agriculture? I think I'm still unmuted. Jeff, I agree with your historical thumbnail sketch of what happened in China. In fact, I hate the word capitalist because it's misused so much and everybody knows what a shoddy term it is. I have to use it because there's nothing better. Capitalist agriculture has been a source of great enrichment in many of the developed world, the rich countries. Argentina in the 19th century and quite a lot of the English-speaking former dominions more recently. And this is also true of the Chinese example that you gave, Jeff, of the household responsibility system, which led to other changes. When I use the term firm, I don't just mean industrial firms. I mean actually a more institutional change in how production is organized. And it's different in agriculture because agriculture inherently works better when it's small scale. And I think the evidence is not really clear on how that works. But outside agriculture, it's very clear that the so-called capitalist form of the firm just produces falls in real costs, not prices, but costs. And that is what is behind the what we talk of as enrichment, because if you can do more for less input, less real input, then you can actually expand the output by not reducing the inputs. I haven't explained that very clearly, but I think the causal dynamic is actually quite straightforward.
I would ask the chair, because I certainly answer too long, that he enforce people to a few sentences, including Jeff and me, or else most of the people here will not get a chance to ask what they want to ask. So let's all be as concise as we can. I can't hear you, Toby. You're talking, but I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, we had some technical issues here, so I switched over to Tobias' computer. Yes, thank you very much for that. That's true. So we have a little more, we have a list here, and you can come back to Michael's questions. But first we have Anne Booth, would like to pose a short question, Anne, and then Nadia. So go ahead, Anne.
Unmute yourself, dear. Anne, unmute yourself.
Is that
There you
it?
go.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That's it.
Well, I suppose the very short question, and this came to me certainly in listening to the discussion about China. The Chinese system, the Maoist system, was of relatively short duration. And before that, you had quite a long tradition in many parts of China of family-based farming. And in a way, what Deng Xiaoping and the reforms did was simply go back 40, 50 years to that system.
Yeah. Well, there's another institution that Steve Chung has emphasized, which is the Xi'an, which is ordinarily translated county, but it doesn't quite fit. But anyway, and the Xi'an, these counties, act like firms. Steve argues, and their competition improves things. Yeah, I speak about China without knowing much about it, as one has to if you're going to do world economic history. And I certainly agree that there's a reinstitution of what in China was the normal way of doing things.
Well, sorry, could I just add one thing? China is a huge country. And of course, there's a lot of variation. But if we look at parts of Southeast Asia during the late colonial period, you had this huge increase of smallholder agriculture geared towards export markets. Rubber's the famous example. Another example, of course, is cocoa and coffee in West Africa.
Sure.
But these were farmers often not well educated, who completely changed their farming systems when the opportunity for global markets expanded.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important development that still hasn't had nearly enough attention on the part of global historians, if you can use that term.
Do you want to respond, Deirdre or Geoffrey?
No. Look, I think we ought to. I'm going to confine my answers from now on to 2 sentences.
Yeah, I bet. So, Nadia.
Thank you very much. This is so interesting. I would like to ask a question from a viewpoint of a researcher that really shares this intermediate vision that you both proposed, right? This intermediate role of both ideas and institutions. I wanted to ask you both, given that there may be so many different factors that, depending on context and on historical era, really play a role, have you observed in your studies a sort of a common element that triggers this change in ethical thinking? I mean, I'm picking now ethical thinking, but I think it fits with the Enlightenment that Geoff mentioned just a few minutes ago.
Geoff?
I mean, of course, we're dealing with a highly complex and changing reality. And there's no one cause of change. There's interconnection. What we have to do is to isolate the more important causes at particular times. And it could be a change in ideas, eventually had effects, and it could be a change in institutional structures. And we get institutional changes sometimes through violent events, through insurrection or civil war or invasion or whatever. And we get internal conflict within institutions, and sometimes that leads to institutional change. We simply have to go case by case. There's no general rule here. And we use theoretical framing and theoretical concepts to try and understand this very complex and often chaotic reality.
It's our scientific responsibility, as Geoff said, to find the big causes. And the big cause, in my view, is the accidents from 1579 that made for European liberalism in northwestern Europe.
Thank you very much. We have a question here from Korean friend. I'm too ignorant with Korean letters and symbols, but I think it's Korean. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the great enrichment, both of the respectable professors well, institutions, ideas, liberalism, and financial the factors. They introduced these factors as important the element. But I think the exchange, the important the system exchange has to be discussed. I think the neoclassical economics fails to explain, particularly the value exchange, is unable to explain the relation between these the factor elements and the exchange.
Well,
you say that there's no explanation. I mean, what about consumer surplus? And that, I mean, it may be a poor explanation, but it's certainly a standard textbook explanation of exchange.
I think he means historically.
Right.
Yeah. However, do you have some other concept of exchange that because we cannot just exclude exchange when we discuss the evaluate the importance of these factors without talking about exchange. That means we don't have the system or mechanism to assess the extent of the importance among these factors. So we need some kind of the link between these the evaluation of factors and the exchange. We cannot just rule out the system of exchange.
But exchange. Look, I've written very extensively on this. Exchange is very, very ancient. If you mean trade, if you simply mean trade, if that's what you mean, if you mean the institution of formal exchanges that set publicly announced prices, those two are quite old. So exchange is something humans have always done.
Can I show you something? I've got here a stone axe, which is 12,000 years old. Found on a mountainside in the Lake District. Now the same stone, the same style of axe can be found all over Europe.
Yep.
There was trade in these things something like 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, there was.
So Deirdre's right, but I think Professor Lee, you're referring to cultural exchange, which is something different. Yeah?
I can't hear you, dear. You've been muted. Unmute yourself.
Exchange, what I talked about is the relation between the persons. So when we exchange the stone axe or cell phone, whatever.
Okay, this is sociological exchange theory. Okay.
I mean the microeconomic aspect.
He's just
microeconomic aspect of exchange.
He's just talking about trade.
Okay.
In which case, your point, Jeff. The earliest example of exchange is 70,000 BCE in the Blombos cave in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. We have at least two more. We can have room for two more questions. The first one to Akash Kumar. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. So my question is regarding the spatial economic zones, and I just wanted to understand how do you think ideas and as opposed to institutions explain the economic growth that was driven by spatial economic zones, not just in China, but for example in Dubai or for example in Dubai or even Hong Kong, which was very close to China, but but definitely we cannot say that the culture in Hong Kong at the time was something which was ready with the ideas of laissez-faire when the Britishers sort of imposed it on Hong Kong. And in line with that, just one further question: what do you think of the future of ideas like charter cities?
The what? I couldn't.
Charter cities. Charter cities.
Jazz of cities.
Charter cities. Charter cities. The idea that Paul Romer came up with.
Look, Hong Kong was essentially a charter city. I have to answer this damn phone or they'll keep going. Let's see. Remind me of the first, with 2 words, the first part of your question.
Yeah, so the first part also had to do with the same thing. That
2 words.
Spatial economic zones and how culture played a role, or how basically ideas played a role. In.
Look, here's the basic point. Good institutions are extremely widespread. The rule of law, for example. Look at the Hebrew Bible. What changed, what was in Northwestern Europe, the accident of liberalism.
I'm going to disagree with Deirdre. I don't think good institutions are that widespread. Okay, the rule of law is fairly imperfect or worse in most countries in the world. There's only about, Benito Ariñada's done some work on this, there's only about a couple of dozen countries where it's possible to secure a mortgage on real estate and get a lower rate of interest. That's because the insecurity of the property rights combined with serious flaws in the legal system, lack of impartiality, corruption, and so on, make it difficult, expensive, or too risky to get a mortgage. And that's in most countries in the world. So effective mortgaging is confined to a relatively few countries. Most of the parts of Eastern Europe where mortgaging doesn't work.
That's why
we don't have ubiquitous good institutions. We have relatively few cases of good institutions.
No, that's wrong. You have to have a scale, Jeff, and I think you'll agree. You have to have 0 to 100, and you have to know what the quantity is. And the Hobbesian view of the war of all against all is not what most societies are.
I agree.
And so the Hobbesian statist solution, which North and Weingast and everyone else adopts, essentially, it's modern economics adopts it, is mistaken historically.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions, and I ask you to ask them in a row, and then you can respond to them, Deirdre and Geoffrey. So we take Anton, I think might be Russian sounding, I don't know, and Mark Morgan. So please pose your questions after each other, starting with Anton.
Thank you, Anton Filipenko, Kyiv, Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko, National University of Kyiv. My question is next to both speakers. How can we identify some common or general logic of institutional development? General logic, please.
Thank you very much. And Mark first.
Yeah, thank you. My question is extremely short to both speakers, is why Western Europe?
I have an answer to number 2. Jeff has an answer to number 1.
on then, Deirdre.
Well,
first.
okay, if you want. It happened in Northwestern Europe, not in Europe. That's one of the problems with this science argument or Enlightenment argument, because Enlightenment happened in Italy. It happened. Catherine the Great was enlightened, but liberalism is a Dutch invention that's transferred to England by the Glorious Revolution, and then shows in Scotland, and then slowly the world. So it's liberalism.
I think the Levelers were there first, though, Deirdre,
in
the 1640s.
I have quoted.
They were great liberals. Anyway, it's my job to answer the first question. I think the first question is about whether we can have a general scheme of analysis to analyze institutions. I'm a Marshallian. I'm a follower of Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall is known for his principles. So he says at one level you have a set of abstract principles, but you don't stick with that. What is less well known for is a detailed empirical study of industrial growth and so on. You need both. You need historical and empirical research, and you need general principles. And you can't do everything with general principles. If there are general principles, I would argue that we can learn from evolutionary theory about general principles, and I've written a whole book on that with Tjobon Knudsen about applying variation, selection, and inheritance to institutions and other aspects of human endeavor. But as we say in that book and emphasize again and again, that's not enough. We need the detailed history, we need the empirics, we need the data, we need to contrast and compare different circumstances. You cannot do it by general principles alone. I mean, mathematicians would like us to find the Holy Grail, the holy set of principles, and we could just churn it out in a model, but reality is not like that.
I agree.
And with that, I think we have to draw the line, and I think, Geoffrey, that you perhaps put up a good theme for a next WINIR event. And I don't think that any of us will have to, should throw any rotten tomatoes at you. You made very good performances, and it was very enriching, I think. And I think I just hand over the word to Tobias to wrap up, and thank you indeed very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I would just like to, on behalf of the WINIR, thank Deirdre and thank Geoffrey for the very stimulating debate and discussion. And of course, also to all of you that contributed with interesting questions for this 90 minutes. Very much, all of you. And as Martin hinted as well, this was our first event, but we're hoping that we will have many more of these digital events over the coming months and year. So do stay posted with the WINIR website, and also look for our emails for the more events. I think Deirdre would like to say something.
Well, I would be very glad, I'm sure Jeff would, to correspond with anyone who wants to continue to discuss this at deirdre2.edu. Please do.
We will take you up on that, Deirdre. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So with that, I thank you all, and have a good day or evening. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.